Youth Synod is wrapping up in Rome. As we await the final document, what can we expect? Joining me now to discuss this and more from Rome is the editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, the papal posse, all together again. Gentlemen, I want to start with something that Cardinal Tagle of the Philippines said the other day at a press conference. He was talking about that term LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, being included in the final document. Listen to what he said.
The approach of the church to the community, the people, the so-called LGBT regarding sexual orientation, etc., was present, many times raised. And the call for the church as a welcoming church, as a church that regards the humanity of everyone, is always present. I should say my hunch is that it will be there.
What is the significance of having this terminology, LGBTQ, included in the document itself? Robert Royal.
Well, first of all, I don't believe that that term is going to be in the final document. From everything that I'm hearing, and especially today, it looks like the Africans have made it clear that they absolutely will not accept that terminology. In fact, an African bishop said today if he took a document back home to his diocese in Cameroon with the term LGBT in it, 99% of the people who would be there to read it wouldn't even know what it was about, what it meant. So I think what Cardinal Tagle was trying to do was to kind of split the difference, to say that in one way, that what he actually said later on in that same press briefing was, if the words are not there, then at least the subject and the concern will be in some way present. I don't think that that's going to satisfy the gay activists and the lobbyists who are even here in Rome in the Sala Stampa. But it looks to me like that explicit language, LGBTQ, et cetera, will not appear in the final document.
Father Murray, what do you make of this? What's the end game here? And what do you worry we're focusing so much on this? The media attention seems to be exclusively focused on this LGBT question.
It is a terrible problem for the church, Raymond, precisely because some of the leadership is pushing the line that Father James Martin has been pushing in his books and speeches, which is that God made you this way. And the assertions made, God made me a homosexual, God made me a bisexual, God made me a transgender person. And this is not true. The church has what we call Christian anthropology. It's understanding of God's creation and then the vocation to which we're called, to the life of grace. It does not include committing acts of sodomy. It does not include saying that God made me a male, but I really am a female, and therefore I'm a female. And it does not include people having sex with people of both sexes and claiming this is their divine vocation. It's a real problem because this is the agenda of the world. This is not Christian revelation. It's certainly not the teaching of the church. And one thing that bothers me always, people bring up, well, if you say these hard truths, you're offending people. And my answer to that is, when you say the truth, you can help someone be set free. The experience of the apostolate courage in the United States is when you tell the truth with love, but nonetheless a truth that jars, people have an opportunity to respond with exactly a conversion, not a submission to the categories of the world. So I'm glad that Bob says he doesn't think it's going to be in the final document because it shouldn't be in the final document.
I want to play you something. Cardinal Blaise Cupich ran a small English language group, to discuss many issues, but homosexuality also came up this past weekend. Listen.
I was asked the question, what is the final document going to have to say to people who are homosexual, who have same-sex attraction, who have this aspect of their life? And my answer was, I think the whole document is something to say to everybody. So we wanted to make sure that people were included and felt included by whatever we had to say.
Now, Robert, you wrote a recent piece on this, and that the Catechism is quite clear on this issue, and that needs to be explored more.
Yeah, I think, though, that they hope to exploit. There's a phrase in the section of the Catechism about people who are same-sex attracted. It makes it clear that they are to be respected because they are human beings made in the image and likeness of God, but that we are also to respect the passage in Genesis right near where that is affirmed in the first pages of the Bible, that male and female He created them, and that there is no Catholic path forward for the acceptance of homosexual activity as such. However, I think that there's a way that they hope that this is going to soften the opposition. And in a way, even just debating this, in a way, gives the impression to lots of young people that, well, this question is up for grabs in the Catholic Church. At some future point, the bishops might make a different decision. And I think this is a general problem that is emerging because the Pope is kind of made it clear that he would like to see a series of regular synods like this that debate substantive questions and then will become part of the ordinary magisterium. And once you start to do that, almost any question can be brought up. So it's very possible that we won't ever feel again that there are settled teachings. So there's a thin edge of the wedge here. But I want to say on the contrary side, I wrote in that same article that I'm tired of talking about this subject about LGBT. And even Cardinal Marx of Germany, who's one of the most progressive bishops in the church and is the leader of a kind of a wing in Germany to talk about these issues. Even he said today that he's tired of talking about it, that this isn't the center of Christ's teaching, that there are many other things that are part of the Catholic faith that are much more wide open and wide-ranging and lead us out of ourselves into the whole world and then into the afterlife.
But this is part of the conversation, if you will. It's not just the people in that hall. It ends up being the media at large, activists, etc. And it seems as the Family Synod became about communion for divorced and remarried Catholics and their new spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends, this is turning into a youth synod that should be about reaching and evangelizing the youth. It's really become about gay rights. One of the proposals that emerged from this small English language group of Cardinal Supaches was this. We propose a separate section for this issue of homosexuality, and that the main objective of this be pastoral accompaniment of these people, which follows the lines of the relevant sections of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Father Jerry, that references what Robert was talking about a little while ago, that they're going to, quote the Catechism, where gay people should not be discriminated against, should be welcomed, and try to expand that a bit. Consider that and relate it, if you will, to what we saw with Amoris Laetitia and the Family Synod.
Yes, the title of this synod, Raymond, is about youth, faith, and vocation. We've heard very little about either of the faith or vocation aspects. Most of the conversation has been centered around young people who don't understand or accept Catholic teaching, and how can we accommodate the church so that they'll be somehow happy or feel part of the church. I get very upset when people say you have to be inclusive. That's meant to cut off discussion. Inclusivity in the mind of the gay rights activists is agree with what we say, grant us same-sex marriage, don't criticize sodomy, and then start believing that there really are transgender and bisexual people made by God to commit those acts. No, this is propaganda effort. The teaching of the church is beautiful, it's rich, it teaches that God made male and female for the complementarity so that new life and love can be brought into the world. This has nothing to do with the satisfaction of disordered desires, and respect for someone who has a disordered desire is to tell them, look, your desire is bad, don't act on it. That's the true accompaniment. To accompany someone by saying, look, I know you feel bad because you can't get married to your, two boyfriends can't get married in church. We're working on changing that. That's not accompaniment. That's what we would call destruction and subversion.
I want to throw something to you here. At a press conference on Tuesday, Bishop Tagle, again, Cardinal Tagle, had this to say about his experience at the Synod. I want you both to react.
The young people were doing a lot for us. They were teaching us. It is not a synod that pretends to provide all solutions and all answers, clear solutions and clear answers. For life is not clear. And the life of the young people now is really not clear.
Bob, I'll start with you. Why have a synod and a final document if there's no clarity in it?
Well, you put your finger on the main point. Look, he's saying that the modern world is complicated, and we know that young people do have a number of choices in front of them that perhaps didn't exist even 10 or 15 years ago, and so they have a difficulty to negotiate this modern world that they're in. But one of the interesting things that also has been taking place at the Synod, and I think that the secular media in a way have been overemphasizing the gay discussion, because there are other things going on. There are conversations about how young people want to be accompanied in the sense of being provided with the rich tradition that the church has, that they need older people, experienced people, experts in theology and philosophy and moral theology to guide them along, to help form them so that they will be full Christians. Now, just yesterday, a book was issued by the Vatican about the wisdom of older people. And in it, the Pope, who's in conversation with a number of people, older and younger, and he writes a couple essays himself, talks about the wisdom of grandparents and recommends that young people pay attention to the wisdom of grandparents. Well, that's great, but how do we get them to listen to grandparents in the first place? Most of the young people who are here are, of course, already intensely engaged with the church. So they're a different cohort than young people as a whole. But to try to convert young people as a whole because they're out in this complicated world, I think we have to establish first a very strong base among the people who are interested already in the church and know that they're lacking something that other people can provide them who are older.
Father Jerry, Bob mentioned this book. There was a book launch that Father Antonio Spadaro, who is part of this book release, it's called Sharing Wisdom, and it was an event running side by side with the Youth Synod. So he said the project is a part of the work of the Synod. And here's what he had to say. He said, Holy Father, at the Synod, the young people showed us the future. Well, today we learn that we must build an alliance between the dreams of the elderly and the future of the young. But Father, the predicate of this whole Synod, and we've been hearing it from these cardinals for weeks now, is that the young are teaching us. I don't hear much in the other way of the cardinals and the church saying, here's the truth, here's what we've learned through 2,000 years, and what you might need for the rest of your little journey.
Very good observation, Raymond. You know, I go back to what our Lord said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nothing could be clearer. And then the teaching that he gave to the apostles over the course of his public ministry, that was not obscure. It was quite clear. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is a fleshing out and an exposition of both the natural law and divine revelation. It's quite clear. People want clarity. St. John Paul II issued the Catechism of the Catholic Church precisely because doctrinal confusion, which was created by people who were unhappy with Catholic doctrine, becomes a means to kind of overthrow the church, overthrow the faith. You know, Cardinal Sarah has written 2 books already in which he is, in an interview form, basically said, the people of today are no different than the people of any other time. They want 2 things. They want to be in love and communion with God, and they want to know what God expects of them, the truth. So truth and love, they're very accessible. Just turn to Christ. We don't need to conduct, a survey of 500,000 people to find out, well, what are you really interested in life? We're not selling a product. This isn't, Coke versus Pepsi. We have to propose Jesus Christ. And if there's one thing I would say, the headlines of the Synod, of course, reflect the secular media, but there hasn't been enough emphasis on getting young people back into the sacramental life of the church and doctrinal formation. That's, the African church is strong precisely because the sacraments and the teaching of the church are loved and appreciated.
Before we leave this discussion of the Youth Synod, gentlemen, I have to share this with you. This is Bishop Andrew Fuwanya, and he's from Cameroon, and he spoke very movingly at a press conference about what's working in Africa and what he believes this Youth Synod should be about. Watch.
People ask me, why are your churches full? Because our traditional values still equate the values in the church. We hand over the tradition of to our young people undiluted and uncontaminated. And that is why we think that in the Synod, we have to be very clear to our young people. While we are listening to them, we should also get the youth to listen to the elders. and that the church is talking to the youth in unambiguous language.
Father Jerry, I'll let you react first and then to Bob.
Well, his words ring true to me. I was pastor of a parish here in Manhattan that served French-speaking Catholics for 14 years, and the majority of my parishioners were new immigrants from French-speaking Africa. And believe me, if you read the catechism and explained it, there were no objections. There was, admitting that this teaching is tough, but one thing we have to remember, what they're dealing with in there is a combination of secularism being imposed by the UN and other organizations, and then we also have the problem of paganism and violence connected with superstition. They understand that the clarity of Catholic teaching is the only liberation that is available to them from the despair of secularism and paganism. So his words are beautiful, and of course, we don't care what the press says. Every Catholic priest and bishop should keep that in mind. We're not trying to create headlines. We're trying to get souls to know Christ. So to speak the truth, whether the media likes or not, we have to speak the truth.
Bob, what has been the impact of the media massage, if you will, on this? The pressure, obviously, the LGBT thing has been very pronounced from the press, and it seems it's leaked into the Synod and maybe even shifted the Synod a bit in the same way the Family Synod was taken over. And what might we expect from a final document?
Well, I actually have a slightly different take on that. I think that the Synod started out with a stronger desire on the part of some of the organizers to push the LGBT themes. And as time went on, I think they got quite a bit of pushback, at least in the press briefings and in the conversations that I've had with people. And you see it that even people like Cardinal Marx and some others who have been strong public supporters of gay rights, gay equality, and some of the lobbyists come out and try to get them to say things. They're very, very wary about stating baldly, I think, what they really believe, and that is that they would like to see the church change in the direction of accepting these things. One of the beautiful things about this African Bishop Joseph is that he's very perceptive, too. He's a very charming personality. And one of the things he said is, look, if we speak to young people and we begin to betray a hint that we're not ourselves convinced of the truth of the faith, they notice it. And they don't get greater confidence. They actually start to be more skeptical if they see that we don't really believe. So this was a challenge to the people who might be intimidated a bit by the way that the media and the lobbying groups have been coming at them. And I think that has happened in a number of different places. It obviously hasn't stopped the discussion. It hasn't just removed that discussion from, I think, what we're even going to see in the final document. But it's been surprising to me how much pushback there has been by some very good bishops, some very clear thinkers that the church has got to have confidence and have something to offer people. Otherwise, they will just continue along with a culture that we know is disastrous.
Very quickly, I want to go to talk of the Archbishop Vigano's third letter. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano dropping a third statement on the church, dispelling and answering back some of the charges that Cardinal Ouellet in the last week, who's a Vatican cardinal, threw toward him. And in that third letter, he states again that there is a conspiracy of silence that has wrought and continues to wreak great harm in the church. He points out two silences. The first regards victims of sexual abuse. He writes this: "It is dismaying that amid all the scandals and indignation, so little thought could be given to those damaged by the sexual predations of those commissioned as ministers of the gospel. It is not a matter of how church historians may evaluate this or that papacy. This is about souls. Many souls have been and are now imperiled of their eternal salvation." Why so little attention to this story in the last few weeks? I'll get you to react, Father Jerry.
Well, the Synod and other things have come up, but I think Archbishop Vigano, responding to Cardinal Ouellet, has said very eloquently what's at stake here. We have a serious problem in the United States with negligence by bishops concerning priests who committed sexual abuse. We have the problem of ex-Cardinal McCarrick. Cardinal McCarrick, when he was cardinal back in June, still cardinal, he was accused and reliably accused, according to the Holy See, of having abused an altar boy in St. Patrick's Cathedral. We're now at the end of October. Why hasn't Cardinal McCarrick's trial happened? Why hasn't he been removed from the priesthood? He wasn't simply negligent about what other people did. He's the one causing the harm. He was then accused by a second person of having abused him since he was 11 years old. The Holy See's reaction cannot be slow and simply issuing apologies. Victims have been coming forward based on the Pennsylvania matter. Now other probes are happening. The Holy See has to act, and that must include, and we talked about this a few months ago, there should be a tribunal set up so that the church investigates her own crimes and doesn't leave it up to the secular authorities to do it. It's a mess. It needs to be cleaned up. And I'm glad the Pope's doing it in Chile. He just removed 2 bishops who committed sexual abuse. Let's start doing it here.
Bob, why hasn't there been more discussion of the sex abuse crisis when you're dealing with young people, and that's apparently anybody 35 and younger? It would seem the elephant in the room and speak right to the church's moral credibility. Why haven't these issues been discussed at any length in this Youth Synod?
Well, they have. They probably haven't been in the media very much, especially back in the United States. But we hear over and over again here in the various meetings involved regarding the Synod that this has been a subject that has come up. In fact, just today, somebody suggested that sex abuse should be on the very first page, perhaps even in the very first paragraph, and the bishops kind of went back and forth on this, whether that was a good idea or not. But I agree with Father very much. I think that the Vatican listens too much to the kind of media that we have here in Europe and primarily in Italy, which doesn't seem to be as outraged about priestly abuse as we tend to be in the United States. They still don't get. And I think that this is a very big problem. They don't understand that the United States is a different kind of culture, that for us, this is almost a defining moment for the Church and for this papacy. And that, as Father rightly says, you cannot just allow secular authorities to pursue people who committed crimes and think that that solves the problem. The Church itself has to show itself capable of recognizing and acting, not just on people who are abusers, but also on bishops who either, whether they abused themselves or whether they covered up or they looked the other way. This is a serious problem defining whether the Church is going to have moral credibility. And one of the reasons why it's come up again and again with the young people is they tell the bishops, and this is one way that they are teaching the bishops something, they tell them that unless this issue is dealt with openly and effectively, it's going to damage your credibility with our age cohort.
I want to share with you Archbishop Vigano's second silence. He's calling it the second silence in the Church. He writes, "This very grave crisis cannot be properly addressed and resolved unless and until we call things by their true names. This is a crisis due to the scourge of homosexuality in its agents, in its motives, in its resistance to reform. It is no exaggeration to say that homosexuality has become a plague in the clergy, and it can only be eradicated with spiritual weapons. It is an enormous hypocrisy to condemn the abuse, claim to weep for the victims, and yet refuse to denounce the root cause of so much sexual abuse, homosexuality." Father Jerry, has that message been received in Rome, or is it being dismissed sort of as a political attempt to take down the Pope and the whole Vigano affair wrapped in the same book?
Well, I will say the Pope in his letter to the Chilean hierarchy did identify the problem of homosexual priests in seminaries preying on seminarians. So the Pope is aware. He knows that in the situation in Chile, this has been a homosexual crisis, and he's taking action there. Look, the problem here gets down to this. People are overly sympathetic to the point of view of say, if someone has a homosexual desire and acts on it, we shouldn't get too upset about it. We should just basically say, well, don't do it anymore, and then that's all. And the way the Church has traditionally taught this is, yeah, we feel sorry for people who have disordered affections, but we do not entrust them with authority over other people. We don't put them in situations where they're going to, repeat offense. And, everyone's saying, well, we have to normalize homosexuality in the life of the church. That's on the other side, I would say. And our answer is, look, normality is what we want to have. We want to help people have a homosexual problem in their life, but we can't just pretend it's not at the root of why all of these victims have been victimized over the years, primarily teenage boys by male clerics. This is a problem.
Bob, the Pope has yet to answer, really, any of these charges that Vigano raises. Can he continue to remain silent? And will he stonewall, do you think, as he did with the dubia, those 5 questions presented by his cardinals? Can he do that?
Well, he can, obviously, but there's going to be a damage to him and there's going to be a damage to the church. And that's going to be a price that's going to have to be paid for not answering something that patently has to be responded to. I think, in a way, that the Willett letter it was concocted to be a kind of a response to Archbishop Vigano. But it's very clear that no one has really stepped forward and rebutted the charges that he makes. They talk about the way he went about it, or, did the Pope, this or that? Was it a sanction? Was it a private letter? These are all secondary issues. The main factor is here that we know that people in the Vatican, going back 15, 20 years, knew very well that McCarrick was damaged goods. And yet somehow he moved up the food chain and became Cardinal Archbishop of Washington. When he retired and those offenses that he had committed earlier could be kind of quietly used to keep him in check. He shouldn't appear in public, shouldn't have public liturgies. He receives a letter from Pope Benedict XVI telling him he should live a life of prayer and penitence. But somehow, when Francis is elected, he comes back from the dead. These things cannot be ignored. They can be ignored, but there's a price to pay for this.
Right.
And enough of this is now known that has not been refuted. There's nothing in the Willett letter that changes those basic facts. This may very well be a defining moment for the papacy, whatever else Pope Francis does.
Wow. Yeah, and he wasn't alone. McCarrick was not the only cardinal or bishop who rose in the ranks and had a record of this sort of thing, and people knew of it. This is just the one instance that Vigano is pointing out where he informed the Pope in this case and other officials at the Vatican, and literally nothing was done. There are reports that the Vatican is laying the groundwork to open formal debate on opening priesthood to married men in parts of the world where clergy is scarce. We already have priests in the Eastern Rite, in the Ordinariate, that are married, men who come over from Anglicanism. Where do you think this is going, Father Jerry, or is this just a distraction to get people to stop talking about the Vigano letter, sex abuse, and all the rest?
Well, it may be both. It may be a distraction, but also a substantive move that the Holy Father is interested in. The Synod on Amazonia will be coming up in 2019, was going to include a discussion of this, because we know that some of the bishops involved have been talking about it. And all I can say is this would be a world-class disaster for the Catholic Church. It's not intrinsically impossible to have married priests. We do have it. But the glory of the Latin Church is that it requires of her priests that they become living icons of Christ. In the way they live without being married. Christ was not married. The priest who represents Christ is not married in the Latin Church for a very important reason. We are totally given over to that spousal relationship with the Church, that we stand in the place of Christ in a sacramental role and a teaching role, and then through the grace of Christ are able to influence people to give their lives to God as married people, as religious, whatever it is. The married clergy is, the Ukrainians have it, the Lebanese, the Episcopalians here in the U.S., but it is not the lived experience of Christianity, and it is not the most perfect representation possible of Christ's life in the world. So I'm very fearful of this, because we should not turn the Catholic Church into a debating club in which everything that people are unhappy with, they feel the right to bring up. The celibacy of clergy was assaulted after the Second Vatican Council, and Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical on the matter stating, no, celibacy is connatural with the priesthood. It's a good thing. It needs to be upheld. The other pontiffs after that, the same thing. this would be a terrible, terrible mistake, and I think most lay people would not be happy with it.
Bob, what Father just mentioned, this notion of a debating club that these synods might indeed turn into, or perhaps are already, does that concern you? That will open up every settled matter and teaching in the church?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier, I think the very form that this is starting to take on can be abused, and it can be abused in a very bad way. Just today, again, the question of women in the church and the possibility of deaconesses came up. And as we know, this has been studied and rejected multiple times. But once you start to have sort of a permanent body that's going to meet every now and then, I mean, we had marriage, and now marriage seems to be more confused. We have young people, and we don't have anything clear, although the young people themselves are asking for clarity and for guidance and for formation and accompaniment. Now, if we turn on to married priesthood and perhaps the role of women in the church, this is going to become an ongoing debating society, when one of the important characteristics of the church, and I think especially important for young people in the very fact that it's so complicated for them in the modern world, is the church has some very clear ideas about the truth, about the way God wants us to live, who we are, what our relationship should be with one another and with God. And that is a saving message even in this world. It gives people a confidence that there's something that they can hold on to in the midst of all the confusion and evil, frankly, that exists in the world as well. So this form of debating a number of things, it may not be everything, but it's enough that it starts to give people the impression. I remember just enough of the post-Vatican II period to know that in those days, people were assuming everything was up for grabs or everything had been changed. There's a real danger that this can happen. And it was just said at one of the briefings this week that the church needs to change. It needs to become something different. Yeah. And it was put in very broad terms, as if it's obvious that what we have is inadequate. I think that this is a dangerous moment, and that we need to proceed very, very carefully so that we don't give the impression that we're just like a political body, that what exists and is true today can be changed tomorrow, and there is no truth to guide us through our lives and into our deaths.
Father Jerry Murray, before I let you go, Bishop Martin Holley, who was the ordinary in Memphis, Tennessee, has been relieved of his duties by the Pope. This happened on Wednesday. It seems there was some confusion or upsetment about the way he reassigned clergy in that diocese. Any insight on this removal?
Yes, there was an uproar because Bishop Holley, in one fell swoop, transferred, I think, more than half of the pastors in the diocese, just moved them around. There was dissatisfaction expressed to the Holy See, and the Holy Father sent Archbishop Wilton Gregory and Archbishop Bernard Hebda to do an apostolic investigation. Obviously, the results of that were that the pastoral imprudence of the bishop was such that he had to leave the diocese. So it's a very regrettable moment, because you hate to see anybody removed who's a sitting bishop. But on the other hand, part of the Holy Father's charge is to be the shepherd of the shepherds. So if a shepherd is not doing a good job, then the Holy Father will bring in someone else. And we pray for peace in that diocese, because this has been very upsetting to the clergy and the laity.
Very good. We will leave it there. Papal Posse, thank you for being with us. Robert Royal's Synod reports and commentary, as well as Father Gerald Murray's commentary, can always be found at thecatholicthing.org.